Good day, everyone. Richard Cowperthwait for Northwest Access TV. Thanks for joining us. Doing another one of a series of joint interviews, forums, debates, whatever you want to call it, with candidates running in contested races here in Franklin County. And boy, this is the first time I've done a show on a competitive state's attorney's race, maybe the first time ever. But anyway, we have a competitive race for Franklin County State's Attorney. Two candidates, John Lavoie, the Franklin County State's Attorney at this point, Democrat from St. Albans City, and Zach White, Republican from Milton. And thanks for joining us. Good to see you folks.
Thank you.
So John, you are the state's attorney. Jim Hughes, after his long career, stepped down recently, and you are the SA at this point.
Right. I took over at the beginning of September from Jim after working for Jim for about 20 years and being a deputy state's attorney for a total of 34 years.
Interesting. And Jim, you do have, Jim is supporting you. You do have
Yes.
Jim's support. In any case, give us a little more background and tell us why you decided to jump into the state's attorney's race and be the top guy.
Well, being a prosecutor has been my entire professional life, except for the couple of years that I spent after law school as a defense attorney. I started about the same time that Jim did. We went to career prosecutor school in Houston, Texas in 1988, and neither one of us did anything else but be a prosecutor from then on. I know poor Zach has had to hear me say this before, I look at being a prosecutor as a calling. I see it as a public responsibility and a fairly heavy one. If you look at our code of ethics, the only obligation that a prosecutor has is to see that justice is done. And it's a difficult and challenging balancing act. And I've had over 3 decades doing it. I've never been the chief prosecutor, although I did lead the Office of Child Support for a year and also stepped in both Windham and Bennington counties to be acting state's attorneys during my boss's absences. But this is a culmination of my professional career.
Zach, take a little time here. Tell us about yourself.
Well, thank you, and thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming.
So I was born and raised on Navy bases my whole life, mainly in Europe and Asia. My family is from the Proctor and Wallingford area, so we spent our summers and our Christmases with my grandparents in Proctor and along Beaver Pond Road. I went to Vermont Law School and graduated in 2012, and since then I've been a criminal defense attorney and a family attorney. I represent children who are involved in the foster care system, and I help parents as well who have their children removed from their care. I've done numerous trials, and I have even attended and graduated from the most prestigious trial practice institute in the country that the Bar Association has, the National Criminal Defense College. I believe what we are lacking in Franklin County for a state's attorney is 2 things. One is proactivity, and the other is leadership. What I found during COVID, even though COVID impacted all of us and for a while shut the court system down, when it reopened, what me and my clients were struggling to deal with was the lack of any response from the state's attorney's office. There was no creativity in trying to resolve cases or deal with issues. And so I know from my own experience in managing small businesses, managing a law firm, that I provide not only that creativity and leadership, but I provide that go-getter attitude. I can't sit and wait for things to happen. I'm much more about jumping right in, being proactive, because I believe in a position such as this, the more proactive steps we take in addressing public safety issues and dealing with court cases and other court issues, the less burdened the entire system becomes. You start to free up resources when you can deal with, for instance, all the low-level misdemeanor cases where there are no victims. Most of those should go to the court diversion process or the Franklin Grand Isle Restorative Justice Center.
Just to be clear, are you talking specifically about the Franklin County State's Attorney's Office, or?
Yes, and I think over COVID what we saw was due to that lack of leadership, it unfortunately, from my perspective, resulted in the criminal court judge having to dismiss hundreds of cases. I think the number was something like 400 or something cases, criminal cases, and that didn't happen in any other county. That happened only in Franklin County. And as the judge made clear in his order, a lot of those cases have been pending for years prior to COVID, some as far back as 2017 and 2018. And so there was a large population of individuals who engaged in criminal conduct that weren't held accountable, whether through the diversion process, the restorative process, or through the court process. And I don't want us as a community to ever get back to that point where it forces a judge to make that tough and difficult decision that ultimately really harms the public safety of the Franklin County community. Because if you engage in criminal conduct, there are ways to hold you accountable. And like I mentioned, court diversion, but those people should have their day in court, and they shouldn't be left, and their attorneys should not be left waiting for a call that never comes from the prosecutor's office.
I'm going to let John respond to that. John, hearing about a lack of leadership.
Well, thanks very much. So Jim was in charge during that time. I was not. So what Zach is saying is that the man who was the prior Franklin County State's Attorney lacked leadership skills, which is nonsense. Anyone who knows Jim Hughes knows that that's not true. The backlog that resulted during COVID resulted because there were no trials for 2 years. Defense attorneys had no incentive to settle cases. Letting a case languish is a common defense tactic, and I'm sure that at the trial advocacy school that Mr. Wade attended, he was probably told about that. The idea of being proactive implies that the state's attorney controls the court calendar, which he does not. We are at the mercy of court clerks and court staff, and everyone has always done the best they could to keep cases moving. The idea that, Zach's numbers are interesting because I think at the last forum we were at, he talked about over 100 cases being dismissed, and now we're up to 400. If you look at the cases that were dismissed, they were mostly driving without license cases, which are victimless crimes, but are crimes nonetheless. And Mr. Hughes had a policy of not referring driving with license suspended cases to diversion if the reason for suspension was a prior DUI. And also, if a person had multiple driving without license offenses, he was not referring those cases. But the idea that you can get rid of a court backlog by using restorative justice is also a false claim. If you're going to submit low-level misdemeanors without victims, what are those cases? Other than driving license suspended, what are the crimes that don't have victims? If someone steals $6 worth of alcohol from Beverage Mart, you might be tempted to say, well, that's a low-level crime. There's no victim there. The owner of Beverage Mart would beg to differ. Now, I'm not saying that a retail theft can't go to diversion, and we do refer retail thefts to diversion, but those cases have victims, and it's a death of 1,000 cuts for them.
Didn't T.J. Donovan jump in concert with Jim Hughes and I think other state's attorneys? Didn't he get involved with a number of cases being expunged? Is that the word I want? Misdemeanor cases, or?
Yeah, and
But you're not talking about those cases that the Attorney General was involved with.
I think both Zach and I signed on to a willingness, and this was during a survey that we took for the ACLU, that we both signed on to the idea of having a sort of amnesty day for DLSs. And that's a way to get rid of a backlog there. But, you know, we had serious felonies that made up a portion of our backlog. Those cases weren't dismissed. We had people incarcerated for multiple years because of COVID who couldn't get a trial. That wasn't on the state's attorneys.
Are things back to normal or not? In the wake of with the pandemic seemingly having eased quite a bit, are things getting back to normal, or is that a dubious word to use?
We're back in court in person. The masking requirements have been removed. Social distancing requirements have been removed. We have been having jury trials since last November. I did the first trial back after COVID. That was an experience because everyone was still masking and social distancing. But we are back on schedule, and at our last bench bar meeting, the clerks were very encouraged by the backlog numbers.
Well, they were encouraged, but we're still double where we need to be. I think that the bench bar meeting, the judge said we had over 1,000 cases pending. We usually have about 500, and this is just criminal cases. And so let me correct the record a little bit. One thing
can we just be as concise as you can?
Of course. It was a couple hundred cases that the judge dismissed, and some of them were negligent operations, violations of conditions of release, some were retail thefts, and some were unlawful trespass, like coming onto Walmart when a year or two ago they trespassed you. What I would note is 97% of all criminal cases in our system are resolved by a conversation between a prosecutor and a defense attorney. They don't go to trial. And in fact, if you look at the numbers that the judiciary has for Franklin County prior to March of 2020 when the court system shut down, we were averaging about 6 to 10 trials a year. So you're talking about 1 trial a month, 12 a year that go to trial. When you have 1,000 or more through the system in a year, so this response that, well, there were serious felony cases, we couldn't do trials, so nothing could move, that misses the point. 97% of all criminal cases that are filed in our system, and this isn't just Vermont, this is nationwide, but specifically with Vermont, they resolve through a conversation between 2 attorneys, the prosecutor and defense attorney. And if there's
often
not a
ending up in
willing party,
a plea agreement, of course.
A plea agreement, referrals to outside community providers like the Restorative Justice Center. And so I never said that the prosecutor controls the court schedule. What I am alluding to is, as the prosecutor, you don't have to sit and wait for the court scheduled hearing in December to decide what you want to do with the case today, especially when you have a defense attorney calling you saying, hey, can we settle this case? Especially when an attorney might represent a victim, which happens, and I have experience representing especially domestic and sexual assault victims in this system, when they're saying, hey, we want to move this case forward, we're willing to be flexible, willing to be creative. And so sitting and just waiting for the court to schedule a hearing and then dealing with the case increases the burden on the court system. And so what I'm offering is a proactive approach to prosecution that would allow the state's attorney to be flexible, the office to be flexible in addressing cases, even if they're not scheduled for a couple of months, to actually be the one outreaching to the defense counsel. This is the only county, I've practiced in all 14, and this is the only county where I have to call to see if we can resolve a case. Every other county, the prosecutor sends you an offer. And so you have a starting place. You know what their thought process is, and it makes it easier to move the case along. Now, not every case can settle. You got to file motions, and you got to wait for the court to schedule an evidentiary hearing. But we can certainly do our part as leaders to alleviate the burden on the court system, which in turn would free up time and resources to focus on those serious cases.
John, you want any quick response to that? And
Yeah, most cases do settle by agreement, and the agreements are reached when there's some pressure on the defense attorney to do it. And the idea that we reach out and we make arraignment offers all the time that are ignored until there's some sort of pressure to do elsewise.
Zach, question, so it's like, again, a defense lawyer, will it be, I guess you can obviously picture you're running for the job, will it be difficult to go from being a defense lawyer to a prosecutor, or is that you see that as any kind of a difficult shift, or not?
No, I don't see it as a difficult shift in terms of my perspective, because as a defense attorney, unlike other professions, my personal beliefs and my political beliefs, my feelings, they don't matter when it comes to representing a client. It doesn't matter what the person is accused of doing. I'm there to make sure that the process is fair, that everything's above board, and that their rights are respected and upheld, especially their constitutional rights. As a prosecutor, I will be able to rely much more on my instincts, but as well as the community's belief in how certain things should be handled, how certain cases should be resolved and issues should be handled. I won't be tethered to a client. So in defense work, the client, the person accused of the crime, or the person whose child has been removed from their care and put into DCF custody, they get to tell me as the attorney, hey, I want a trial, or I want to negotiate a resolution. I've had many clients tell me they want a trial when I don't think legally it's probably in their best interest, and also vice versa. I won't have to deal with those issues necessarily as a prosecutor. The perspective that I do bring, however, that I think would be a benefit would be that I have sat with kids at DCF as they're being soon whisked away to southern Vermont, away from their family, and they don't understand. And I've been the one left responsible to help them in that moment, to reach out to them and to if I can, help them understand that this isn't about any negative or bad thing that they did. It's unfortunately a court process and a system. And so I would offer that empathy towards those children in the foster care system, and also the perspective of, I see what the criminal system does to victims, because I represent them, especially in RFA court, but I also see what the criminal system does to those accused of crimes. Even when they are dead serious, they are accountable, they are responsible for the conduct they engaged in, and they want to resolve the case, it destroys people's lives and livelihoods. And to take that perspective into the role of state's attorney can only increase the empathy that I have and will utilize when I'm dealing with victims in their consideration, small business owners in their consideration, and the community at large.
John, even talking more generally, do you see any issue, any problem with a kind of a veteran defense lawyer becoming a prosecutor?
Of course. It's a completely different mindset. I live in this community, and I've lived here for 30 years. Zach lives in Chittenden County. When I go down the street and someone says hello to me and I don't immediately recognize them, I don't know if they're victim, defendant, juror, witness, but I try to treat everyone fairly. And this might sound like baloney, but I take into consideration the heavy responsibility that we have as prosecutors. I know the effect that a criminal conviction, even a minor one, can have on someone's life. And if I'm pursuing a case, it's only because I feel that this is what's necessary, that I've got proof beyond a reasonable doubt. It's necessary to hold this person accountable. But ultimate success in any criminal prosecution for me is never seeing that defendant again. How can we fix this person? Is it mental health counseling? substance abuse issues? What does he or she need so that we never see them again? And when you're dealing with victims who obviously have a perspective on how they'd like the case to come out, sometimes prosecutors have the difficult responsibility of explaining to victims that the case we have can't be proven beyond a reasonable doubt, that the case may not even be a criminal matter, even though you've suffered some harm. And then there are the victims who don't want a prosecution pursued. In 75% of domestic violence cases, victims don't want us to pursue the case. And we're in a position, if we have an evidence-based prosecution where we feel we can continue with the case, that it's necessary to do so even if the victim doesn't want it to happen, because we know about the cycle of domestic violence and we feel that this is the best way to protect that person, even though they may not want the state involved at that time.
Zach, do you see, again, you're a resident of Milton, Chittenden County, just across the Franklin County line. Do you see that as a handicap in this race, not being a Franklin County resident, or does that seem irrelevant issue?
No, I've met many people that are concerned with that, and I understand that. My response is, all I can tell them is that my family and I tried everything we could over the past year and a half to move into Franklin County, and we got outbid on about 6 or 7 homes. In addition, and John might like this, irrespective of the outcome of the election, even if Mr. Lavoie wins, my family and I still plan to move to Franklin County. Our goal is to build our dream home here. I will say that, you know, Milton is a flavor different in Chittenden County. A lot of people refer it to, that I've met up here in St. Albans and Swanton,
Franklin County South?
As Franklin County South. You know, Milton and Georgia share law enforcement. We share the 911 response. Milton now, for instance, has, due to the census and the state legislators, we share a state senate and a state rep with Georgia and a state senator with Fairfax. So that wouldn't make sense for like Burlington or Colchester, but for Milton, it's the similar flavor as southern Franklin County. But all I can do is assure people that I spend 5 days a week dealing with Franklin County cases. My whole law firm practice and management is based on Franklin County. There's obviously Grand Isles involved with that as well. I have experience with Mr. DeSabato and his state's attorney's office. But really all I can tell him is that, you know, watch me. I'm going to be, irrespective of the outcome on November 8th, I'm going to be a Franklin County resident.
Okay. We also have, of course, a contested Franklin County sheriff's race. 3 candidates, 2 write-in candidates, and John Grissmore, the only person on the ballot in that election. That situation's gotten a lot of attention from with the August 7th incident, John Grissmore eventually losing his job with the sheriff's department. State police have been investigating. John, as the state's attorney, have you seen anything? Can you tell us anything about about that investigation by VSP?
I spoke with the local state police lieutenant last week, who had case materials in his possession for review. Their plan was to move the case up the state police chain of command, have the investigation approved, and then refer it to the state's attorney.
So that has not happened yet?
It's not happened yet.
And you and the Franklin County State's Attorney's Office would get the first look at this?
We get the first look at it, yes, but it is unlikely that we would prosecute the case.
Right.
I would immediately refer it to the Attorney General, but I would have a conversation with the Attorney General to see how quickly they would intend to pursue the case.
Right.
I would be concerned by that.
And correct me if I'm wrong, I think both of you folks, correct me if I'm wrong, are both on record in the wake of this incident and what happened, saying that Mr. Grissmore should withdraw from the race.
That's correct.
correct.
I guess you may have seen it. I did a lengthy interview with John Grissmore a while back, and I guess you saw that.
Yeah.
It's like you saw parts of it. That didn't change your mind at all?
Oh, no.
There are people who have done less with worse evidence who have been charged with a crime. And I'm certainly not looking for Mr. Lavoie or his office to make a declaration before the evidence is in, but I certainly can. What he did was at the very least simple assault. And I would be very concerned, as state's attorney, to refer it to the Attorney General's office, which has a history of not charging law enforcement officers and making those cases go away, to the point where what we saw with, at the time, Attorney General Donovan, he actually changed course after the George Floyd incident in Minneapolis, because he realized that the use of force expert he was using was not credible, but he had been using it for years. And so I would be very concerned about the prosecution of the case leaving our county, leaving our community, and going to a prosecutorial office that has a history of picking and choosing which law enforcement officers they charge with a criminal offense.
Just to say,
Well,
we're down to just about 3 minutes. You have to be real concise, but...
I don't know, even Zach coming in from the outside, I don't know how we don't refer this case. Because this is someone who's been submitting cases to the state's attorney's office for years that we've prosecuted on his behalf. How do we avoid an appearance of impropriety, and just turn around and now prosecute this person? I'm not ruling it out altogether. I would consult with the Board of Professional Responsibility, but it looks like a pretty clear
It
conflict.
sounds like Zach expects a criminal charge to come out of this. Do you also, John? Or
Zach knows he's got me over a barrel here as, the current state's attorney.
Yeah.
It would be unethical for me to make a comment about that.
Okay, but again, you haven't seen anything
Right,
yet.
right. But having seen what I've seen so far, it seems that a criminal charge is likely, but I haven't seen the results of the investigation.
Yeah, just down to about, we could probably take a lot more time, down to about a couple minutes. This was a story from the Caledonian Record out of St. Jay last week, but I hear this frustration in the public. This is a guy who was charged with stealing a truck. This guy has 17 felony charges and 42 misdemeanor charges on his record and has now more charges. But I wake up to the folks at WVMT every morning on radio. And again, just a number of incidents in Burlington with, just seems like, folks who are doing, criminal acts just, keep reappearing, get released on conditions, come back. Again, in 30 seconds, it just seems like the public's very frustrated. Is that just kind of the way things are these days, John? Or
Well,
I'm sure you could take an hour on that.
I just sentenced a young man last week, Jason Bacchus, who was one of the few people that was charged as a habitual offender, meaning he had prior felony convictions, who got a healthy jail sentence. And
So it can happen.
It can happen. Judges sentence, prosecutors make recommendation. But the idea of, I understand the frustration when you look at a criminal record and see somebody who reoffends. But that reoffense is taken into consideration by all the parties when that person does surface again.
Right. Zach, sorry, down to, I'll give you 30 seconds to close, whatever, comment on that, but literally half a minute.
Yeah, sure. It is correct that the judge is ultimately responsible for whether to hold that person in prison or not. Where I view, and I think I'm a little bit different than John in this approach, is as state's attorney, I wouldn't just leave the courtroom and say, well, unfortunately, he's out. We'll probably see him again. I would, if needed, hold a press conference and make it clear that
That's
our
unethical.
office...
That's unethical.
It is not unethical. It happens all the time in multiple counties.
Maybe on TV, but
It happens in multiple counties, Orleans and Chittenden. It happens in Washington. And you talk about what you are trying to do to keep the public safe and how you're up against a system that is due process and constitutionally based, and ultimately we're advocates, and it's the judge that makes the decision.
I'll give you a couple seconds, literally.
Trying to use the press to influence what happens in court is absolutely unethical.
It's informing the public about what is happening in their community. I'm not trying to influence any judge.
Okay, on that note, gentlemen, we could take another half hour, but anyway, I appreciate the time.
Thank you.
Zach Waite, Republican from Milton, and John Lavoie, the state's attorney from Franklin County, both running for Franklin County State's Attorney. You can vote between now and Election Day on November 8th. Thanks for the time. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks to producer Alan. I'm Richard Cowperthwait. We'll see you next time on Northwest Access TV. See ya.